ticket if you lost yours. No, you did not lose yours, David. Just a couple of things. We just wanted to recognize that all of Manitoba right now is in a state of emergency because of the wildfires. We have one city, Flin Flon, Manitoba. It's northern. They've been evacuated. They had to be out by midnight last night. I think 17,000 people as of last night were evacuated. So just want to, think about them and hope that everything works out and everyone is able to be safe. One more piece we just need to acknowledge is you might notice that Kirk has moved to Burge's chair. Burge had to leave last night for a personal matter. Everything's fine, but we just ask also that you don't reach out to her right now just because she's very busy with everything. I've been keeping very close contact with her, so I'll just give you updates through the day, right? But yeah, so that's why Kirk is now Burge, and thank you. And if I need Kirk to do something else, he'll be kind of filling all kinds of roles, so thank you, Kirk. So I hope everyone had a good day yesterday. Thank you for your patience and collaboration as you learn alongside us. Exciting day today. It's going to be a little bit different approach today. So first we'll hear from an external expert, Dr. Tammy Bernasky, followed by a panel with USGA members with lived experience. And then this afternoon we're having a speaker on LGBT, I don't know, you think I would know them all, hey, but like LGBTQIA plus, I think it is, maybe another one in there. She'll be coming, 2S, that's right, 2S. I think there's a Q too. Anyway, so then she'll be having a discussion with us, and then myself, Laura Wildley, and Sherry Shifley from the committee will be doing a bit of a couch talk, but we didn't have enough money for a couch, so we'll just be sitting in chairs, so pretend it's a couch. And that's all I have for this morning. Eric, over to you.
Donc, bon matin tout le monde. Tammy Bernasky a une longue expérience du handicap et plus de 25 ans d'expérience dans le domaine de l'inclusion des personnes handicapées au niveau local, national et international. Elle a suivi une formation d'été sur la Convention relative aux droits des personnes handicapées à l'Université d'Irlande à Galway en 2011. C'est là qu'elle a été motivée à poursuivre ses études sur le droit des personnes handicapées à temps plein. Elle a obtenu une maîtrise puis un doctorat en études critiques sur l'handicap à l'Université York en 2020, où elle s'est concentrée sur l'organisation communautaire pour mettre fin à la violence fondée sur le sexe et le handicap. Tammy a siégé à des conseils d'administration et des comités consultatifs pour des organismes de personnes handicapées et communautaires en Nouvelle-Écosse et en Ontario. Au cours de sa maîtrise et de son doctorat, elle a travaillé avec Disability Rights Promotion International ainsi qu'avec le Center for Research on Work and Disability Policy. En utilisant une perspective intersectionnelle, Tammy centre les histoires des personnes handicapées dans ses recherches qui ont inclus des projets sur le handicap et le genre, la violence fondée sur le sexe chez les élèves de niveau postsecondaire en Nouvelle-Écosse et le soutien par les pères et les femmes ayant une déficience intellectuelle en Ontario. En 2023, Tammy a dirigé les efforts visant à accroître la visibilité du handicap au sein de la première Commission des Nations unies sur le désarmement et la sécurité internationale. C'est ainsi que la première déclaration de la société civile sur le handicap et le désarmement a été lue à la première commission en 2024. Tammy adore enseigner, faire de la recherche et écrire. Elle s'est engagée à faire progresser les droits des personnes handicapées et à travailler en vue de l'inclusion significative de diverses personnes handicapées dans tous les domaines de la vie. Tammy, welcome.
Hi, everyone. You look like a very friendly group, so I'm very much looking forward to this. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I always get really excited when people want to talk about accessibility and disability inclusion. It's my lifelong work, my lifelong experience, and in terms of my adult life, quite a bit of experience doing this work. at local, international, and national levels as well. Is this the cue button that I push if I need to go to the next slide? Great, thank you. That's handy. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about inclusion in the workplace. I'm also going to talk a lot about perception. Much of my work is about changing perceptions of disability and also understanding evolving concepts of disability. So that's what I'll talk about today. And then I think I'll save about 20 minutes for questions at the end. Normally I do interactive stuff, but this is a larger group, so I'm just going to give you what I know and then save your questions, and we'll talk about those at the end. It says, oh, is this moving the slides? Sorry. Am I supposed to push the green button? Sorry. Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, this is actually the advancer. Thank you. Okay, sorry. I thought I was giving a cue to somebody else. Okay, so I'll start by just saying a little bit about myself. Like I said, I have lifelong experience of disability. It's evolved and changed over time. I am a professor of political science at Cape Breton University. I really appreciated the song at the beginning. Welcome to Nova Scotia if you haven't been here before. So I work in the Department of Illinois Political and Social Studies. I do a lot of work on policy issues and equity issues. So my background is in disability studies. I have a master's and a PhD in critical disability studies. And like I said, I study a lot about perceptions and about inclusion and what it means to feel included in society for very diverse groups of people with disabilities. I'll start by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by treaties of peace and friendship, but no lands were ever signed over, and these treaties have existed since 1725. And I understand yesterday you got to go to the Black Cultural Center. I've been there several times. It's a wonderful spot. I hope you enjoyed all of the learning that could happen there. And by now you know about the history of African individuals in this province as well. Okay, so what I like to do, and it's a big part of my field, is to describe what I look like for accessibility reasons. So I'm a middle-aged, 5'2" white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing red glasses. I have a beige top on with a colorful scarf. And in terms of the objectives today, we're going to talk about defining disability or not, what it means in terms of language. So we'll talk about a little bit, I'm not going to go into too much detail, about models of disability because they inform the way that we speak about disability. Am I going too fast? Is it okay? Yeah? Okay. I'll talk a little bit about human rights and accessibility. So it's Access Awareness Week. So it's a great time to be here. And then I'll talk a lot more about attitudes and beliefs about disabilities because I think that's really where exclusion stems from. So we'll talk about why those attitudes exist and how they play out in daily life. And then, of course, I'll talk about employment and disability, and I'll end with some recommendations on how to be more inclusive and how to be more accessible in employment. All right. So I have notes here just so I stay on track and I don't forget to say the things I want to say. But in terms of disability, it is an evolving concept. If you look at the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it doesn't actually define disability. It gives types, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but it treats disability as an evolving concept because what we know about disability can change over time, and our experience of disability can change across time and space. I'm going to give some statistics. I don't know how accurate they are, but the World Report on Disability and then has since been updated to say that 15% of the world population has a disability. It's over 1 billion people, which makes it the largest minority group, makes us the largest minority group in the world. I would argue that that rate is actually higher, just because a lot of people, there's a lot of stigma attached to disability, and sometimes people don't disclose. And then also in some cultures and some places, people are often hidden in community, inside their homes, instead of being in community, so it's not often reported as well. And then people can acquire disabilities over time. Sometimes they don't have a disability when they had it when they were younger. All kinds of things can change. But in terms of statistics, it's about 15%. But here in Nova Scotia, our rate is actually higher. So the most recent statistics say that about 38% of people in Nova Scotia have a disability. So I think it's important to recognize that if there's over 1 billion people in the world that have a disability, we don't all agree on everything, right? And so there's a couple of things here. Some people use particular language, other people might use different language. It just depends on the person. But also, it also means that people are very diverse, and no two experiences of disability are the same, because it depends on all kinds of things, like where you live, what your impairment might be, how it interacts with your environment and society and attitudinal beliefs and all of that. So really, we need to be thinking about addressing individuals and their needs rather than medicalizing them and trying to understand specifically what their disability is. In terms of types, though, this is the definition that I use when I do research. So I do a lot of research with people with disabilities. My specialization is gender and disability-based violence. For my dissertation, I interviewed advocates the world over on their work around ending gender-based violence. I was very fortunate to meet a number of people, sometimes in their country, sometimes here, to talk about the disability experience and the interactions of gender and disability-based violence. I've since branched out a little bit to talk more about structural violence. And so what I mean by structural violence is to say that the way that systems are set up to create barriers for individuals can be very violent for people. And so my work has branched out quite a bit to include things like education and employment. It's all connected, right? If you don't have access to education, you don't get access to employment, you might not be included. There's a high rate of high correlation between disability and poverty, for example. So anyway, when I'm doing my research, this is the definition that I use. A disability could be physical, mental, intellectual, learning, sensory, neurodivergent, or episodic in nature that in interaction with the environment or society creates barriers. So what's really important is the interaction, right? So we all have experiences and embodiments, but how does that interact with not just the built environment, but people's attitudes and society. So that's really important. And it's really about understanding whether or not people experience barriers and how they see themselves. I never ask anybody to prove that they have a disability. I want to know if they self-identify, right? Sometimes it can be, what's the word? It can be not dangerous, but it can be risky to identify having a disability in some settings, right? So it's really about self-identifying and not proving a medical condition. But do you feel like because of your embodiment, do you experience barriers? A disability can be episodic, which can confuse people. So sometimes we might experience our disability and the barriers, and sometimes we might not have that particular embodiment. It can change over time. And anybody can acquire a disability at any time. I think people learn that as they get older sometimes. And it's really about thinking about how to make sure everybody's feeling included. Okay. If I was teaching, I'd say, is there any questions now? But I think I'm supposed to go through the whole thing, so just write down your questions and I'll get to them at the end. But I really want to ask if there's any questions. Okay, so I wanted to talk about language, because people sometimes don't know what to say because they just don't have the interaction. And my goal in all of my work is to make you feel comfortable about talking about and thinking about disability and how to have conversations about it, if you have to have conversations about it. So I thought I would just draw your attention to 3 different models. There are lots, and there's a lot I could say about these, but I'll keep it short, just to give you a sense of how we've talked about and thought about disability over time. I've had my disability my whole life, but I didn't actually learn about these models until about 2010, when I went to Ireland for a summer school on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And I had no idea there was a whole group of people working on rights issues. I'm going to tell you a story, actually, because this is where my mind shifted. On my way to Ireland, I flew through New Jersey. I have a physical disability, so I requested assistance. So on my ticket, there was a little symbol to say that I requested assistance. So I flew through New Jersey to Ireland. I really didn't want to miss that flight. So I landed in New Jersey. And I said to the agent, I've requested assistance. Could you help me get to the next gate? Because it's an international flight. It's very stressful, as you know, flying. And the lady says, oh, do you have a wheelchair? And I said, no. I said, but I've requested assistance. It's right here on my ticket. If you don't have a wheelchair, I'm not helping you. And I in my mind, I was like, I just need to get to my flight. She said, it's not far, you can walk. And so at the time, I didn't know much about anything, and I was like, well, I'm not going to fight with her. I guess I'll have to walk. It wasn't just around the corner. It took me a while to get there. And just as I was arriving at the gate, the golf cart with the people that had requested assistance was pulling up, and I was like, oh my gosh, that would have saved me a lot of time and effort. Anyway, I was just so happy I made the flight, I didn't think much of it. I get to the summer school, and they're talking about rights and inclusion, and halfway through I was like, oh my gosh, my rights were violated. So on the way back, when I got to the airport in Ireland, I said, excuse me, I'm a little stressed about flying. I think my rights were violated on the way here, and instantly that got her attention, right? I had people escorting me from gate to gate. When I got on the plane, people were asking me, like the agent was making sure I was comfortable. But honestly, I didn't really think about my rights being violated until I was at this summer school. So the rights-based approach is really important. I wasn't meaning to tell that story, but I think it makes a point, because a lot of people with disabilities don't know that there's people working on rights issues or inclusion issues. Okay, so the medical model. This is the standard way that people with disabilities have been treated. Often when we require accommodations, it's very medicalized, right? A lot of people with disabilities are medicalized. So the idea here, have you heard of this model? The medical model? Okay, look at me asking questions. Anyway, it's about fixing the individual to fit into society. So how can we fix you to be as most like the norm as possible, right? I would say that there's room for medicalization, right? Because people need medical attention and assistance. But this approach really puts the onus on the individual to fit into the spaces they're in. The social model is really where things started to change. Emerged out of the UK, Collins and Burns, and in the slides I put some references at the end. I don't know if I made references to these. Anyway, the social model really shifts the focus from the individual to society. So it's not about fixing the individual to fit into society, but actually it's society that creates the barriers, and it separates impairment from disability. So when you think about language, some people in the disability community prefer to be called disabled. And the reason for many is because they feel like they're disabled by society. So they live with their impairment, and they're disabled by society, by barriers, by whatever the case might be, attitudes, right? Whereas the rights-based approach really emerged in thinking about the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is one of the fastest drafted conventions, had a high level of civil society participation. Really talks about individuals as rights holders. So it's not just about accommodating people, but they're actually people with agency and not just people that need to be accommodated. Okay, make sure I said everything I wanted to here. All right, and then before the rights-based model, disability was largely seen as like a social policy issue rather than looking at people as rights holders. The CRPD, or the convention, came into force in 2008, and it really put the focus on, it didn't create any new rights for people with disabilities, it just ensured that they received the rights they were already entitled to. Okay, and then people who say person with a disability often subscribe to the rights-based model. In the convention, they say person with a disability. So sometimes you'll hear some people say, I'm disabled. Other people might say, I'm a person with disability, and sometimes we fight over it, right? But that's because we don't all agree. There's too many of us, right? And we don't have to agree. I think, though, the important thing here is to think about language. The slide basically just says what I'm trying to reiterate, that we're large and diverse as a group of people. But the idea here is that sometimes I hear language like differently abled. And I think, I'm not sure where that comes from, but I think it's a place of like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I'm going to say differently abled. And maybe there might be an assumption there that if I say disabled or a person with a disability, that's a negative thing, it's a negative connotation. My goal is to get to a point in society where if I say I'm disabled, it's not a negative connotation. Or if I say I'm a person with a disability, it's not thought of as, oh, that's bad, that's too bad, oh, I'm sorry. Or, oh, good for you, you're surviving despite the fact that you have a disability. I would like to get to a point where I can just say, if I have to, that I have a disability, and it's just a part of my identity. I put a little link here if you want to look at it later around words to use and words not to use. So we try to stay away from things that might be more negative, such as, I guess a common one would be wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. We would say wheelchair user, right? Because the person's using the wheelchair. It's not about, the negative connotation isn't there if you say wheelchair user. Yeah, so there's lots of different ways to think about language. It's okay to say disabled or person with a disability. If you're not sure, if you have to use that term, you can just ask. Most people don't get offended. I would rather if somebody asked me a question rather than assume it. But I do understand it's uncomfortable if you're not used to talking to people about disability. It's not common in your life that you're going to have to use this language anyway. Like, you really don't need to be talking to people directly about their disabilities unless you're providing accommodation. And even then, you're talking about the accommodation. You don't need to know the medical side of why they need the accommodation, right? Making sense? Yeah, oh, you're such a receptive and kind-looking group. This is great. Okay. I should note here, though, it's complicated. There's a lot of different scholars in here. Some scholars who subscribe to the social model would even still say, despite the fact, even if we removed all the barriers in society, people with impairments might still live with certain limitations. So I might still have a hard time walking on a sidewalk, even if it was perfectly flat, right? So there's still some difficult things about living with a different embodiment than the norm, right? But the idea here is to really think about the barriers and removing them. If you went down the road of universal design, that would just be great for everybody. So if, for example, if you're shoveling snow and you're clearing pathways at work, why not do the ramp first? Because then everybody can use it, right? Or whatever the case might be. So it's all about thinking about ways to make things accessible for everybody. So that's a little bit about language. I'm going to talk about rights here. I already talked a little bit about the convention. I'll go through some of the principles in the next slide. The convention was really important, though, for really putting people with disabilities kind of on the map in terms of the rights agenda. Just checking the time here. Okay. We also have the Accessible Canada Act, which, are you familiar with the Accessible Canada Act? No. Okay. I'm going to help you become familiar. The Act is, I think I'm getting to that on the next slide, actually. Yes, I am. I'll come to that in just a minute. I'll just go through these three first. So at the international level, we have the convention. Canada is a signatory. At the national level, we have the Accessible Canada Act. And more, we have at the provincial level, provincial accessibility acts. And they often just align with the federal act, except they include education, because education is a provincial responsibility. So Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, British Columbia, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick all now have accessibility acts within their provincial legislation. Okay, so I'm going to go through a little bit about the national and international level. I've been very fortunate. I've worked on a lot of really interesting projects looking at disability rights. When I was doing my PhD, I worked with Disability Rights Promotion International. I was able to look at these rights in various countries, including Canada, India, Bangladesh, Nepal. But we were looking at things like dignity, autonomy, participation, inclusion, and accessibility, which is what we're focusing on, non-discrimination and equality, and then respect for difference. These are core principles within the convention. Autonomy is really important. You want to be able to be in a situation where people get to make decisions about their own lives. And hopefully, if we're accommodating people correctly, this kind of thing can happen. And dignity is really at the core of human rights, right? It's one of the oldest concepts. We want people to feel like they have dignity. When I think about inclusion, which is on the third point on the top, it's about not feeling like an afterthought. That's the simplest way I can put it. In education, I will say to people, you know, it's one thing to make a room accessible, right? You can put people in a room, but are they in a room that they can move around and learn in, right? And so if you set up a space where everything is already accessible, the person feels like, oh, my embodiment has been thought of. I feel included here. I don't feel like an afterthought. So that's really what inclusion is for me. And I use that in all areas of life, whether it's education or employment. I do a lot in healthcare policy, so I look a lot at equity issues in healthcare. I could go on about that for a long time, but I won't today. Non-discrimination and equality, and then respecting difference. I think diversity is a good thing. And when I'm talking about disability, I always talk about it as a positive thing. I think that people with disabilities bring a lot to the table. If you think about all the ways in which people with disabilities have to navigate worlds that aren't designed for them, they become very resourceful in doing things. They have to learn how to do things differently all the time. So when the general population, if I can put it that way, comes to a situation where things might be difficult, those people might actually have really good points of view because they've had a lifetime, often, of experience trying to navigate a world that's not meant for them. Okay, so those are the principles in the convention. Am I going too fast? You're okay? Okay. All right. The Accessibility Act in Canada, I'm very happy that we have this. It's about the full and equal participation of all people with disabilities. Came about in 2019, and it looks at accessibility in a number of areas. It applies to organizations under federal responsibility, okay? So, and some private organizations too, like banks and transportation. And then also the Canadian Forces and the RCMP. So any organization that's serving the public, basically, falls under the Accessible Canada Act. And they have to, under these guidelines, there has to be standards and plans related to the built environment. That's usually the first one that gets addressed because it's the most obvious. Employment, goods and services, the designs of programs and services, communication and transportation. That's at the federal level. Okay, so those are the areas that have to be addressed within the Accessible Canada Act, and I think it's the goal, not the deadline, the goal is to have things accessible by 2040. At the provincial level, sorry, I didn't make a slide specifically for the provincial level because there's so many different provinces. At the provincial level, most acts will also include education. Here in Nova Scotia, I was very fortunate to work on a quality of life index for people with disabilities to help measure progress against our act. And so I included those areas that are here, education, but then I expanded it because when we think about quality of life, we have to think about things like health. Justice is really important. There's a whole section on justice. And here we're looking at not just access to justice if your rights have been violated, but what if you're a person that's interacting with the system? Maybe you've been incarcerated. What about your rights then? So there's a whole section on justice as well, the environment, emergencies, all of those kinds of things. So in terms of provincial standards, they usually follow the Accessible Canada Act. The provinces that have created their own acts, they have to have standards developed for public sectors as well, in terms of education, employment, and all of these areas. So there's lots in place in Canada at the local, national, and even at the international level to help promote and protect the rights of people with disabilities. And there's a lot around accessibility there. Okay. Let's talk about ableism. I put a link to the quote, a reference to the quote here. I'll just read the definition for you. Ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing, and that's in quotes, and defines people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations about people with disabilities. And I think this is really important. I teach a course on stigma, and we look a lot at ableism and where do these beliefs come from? Why does this exist? And why do we see people and instantly feel like they're less than for some reason? This is where perception really comes in, and it's really important. It can influence whether or not somebody wants to disclose that they need an accommodation, which is really unfortunate. I did a talk similar to this once, and somebody raised their hand and they said, I have a family and I also have a disability. I feel like I have to choose which kind of accommodation I ask for. Do I ask for accommodation so I can help support my family and be there for them, or do I ask for a disability accommodation? Like, why can't you ask for both, right? If you give people the accommodations they need, they can do their jobs better. And often it's not, well, I'll get into this a bit later, but the perception is that it's costly and that there's liabilities and all this stuff, and it's really not the case. If you give people what they need to do their jobs or to succeed in society, they do quite well. But there's a lot of misconceptions that can exist. So because of ableism, if people have invisible disabilities, they don't often want to disclose. I don't have a choice. My disability is very obvious. This part of my disability, my physical part of my disability is very obvious. So I have to have accommodations. My whole life I've had to do this. But I know that there's a lot of people who have invisible disabilities who don't want to say it. People have told me this directly, like, I'm afraid if I ask for an accommodation, they're going to think I can't do my job. And people have said this to me in situations where I would have asked the same person for an accommodation and not thought twice about it, right? And that makes me sad, because if the person has the accommodation they need, they can just do their job better. Because unfortunately, a lot of people struggle to do their jobs because they're afraid to say, I need something to make things a bit easier. We all need accommodations. Whether you have a family, you might need accommodation for scheduling. Religious accommodations happen all the time, right? So there's lots of different ways that we get accommodated in society and in the workplace, but disability accommodations, again, there's that perception that if I ask for that, they're going to think I'm not competent. I like to think that I'm very good at my job. I love teaching, best job I ever had. I have a lot of accommodations. I often ask for a classroom that's close to where I'm teaching, so I'm not out of breath by the time I get there. I often ask for a student to come in and help me hand out tests, because up until last week I was using a walker, and so I couldn't get around my classroom. So I said, I can't do that. What am I going to do? So I'm looking for a solution, and all I had to do was ask for somebody to come help. Nobody thought I could do my job any less because I was asking a student to hand out some papers. I was still doing my job. I'm still grading. I'm still doing all of that. And the students didn't seem to think that I was any, less of a good teacher because I needed those accommodations. But lots of people don't have that opportunity. So when I do talks like this, I really want to instill that we can do our jobs quite well if you feel like you're supported. When I started the job I'm currently in, the person that set everything up for me had thought about accommodations even before I got there. So from day one, I already felt like I was included, and I never felt like I had to tiptoe around asking for things. It just happened very naturally. And it didn't cost a lot of money. It doesn't cost a lot to have my classroom closer to where where my office is. So there's lots of different things that can happen. And then on the other side, because of ableism, people that are giving the accommodations might have these negative perceptions about somebody because they have all these ingrained beliefs and they probably don't even know where they came from. They just believe it to be true, right? So on both sides, ableism affects us because we don't want to ask for the accommodation, and sometimes we don't want to give it. So it's really important to think about where that comes from. I once taught a course on disability in the media. I was super excited about this. Think about disability in the media for a minute. You probably haven't. Oh, look at me making assumptions. You might have thought about it, but if you haven't, we're going to think about it for a minute now. There are a lot of attitudes that play out in media. So media does a lot of things. It reflects what we believe in society, and it also perpetuates it, right? So I spent a whole class with students looking at these attitudes that are on the slide, and I'll go through them, and how they play out in media, and why, and who gets to represent those characters. Usually it's able-bodied people. Why is that, right? So let's think about these attitudes. They don't just play out in media, they play out in society, okay? So there's attitudes about the idea that disability is undesirable. Nobody wants to have a disability. They feel sorry for you when you do. Or that it's tragic, especially if somebody acquires a disability. There's this whole tragic narrative that plays out for people, which got me thinking, I've had my disability my whole life, but what if somebody acquires a disability, but prior to that, they've been exposed to these assumptions? They might think, oh my gosh, my life is ruined because this is a tragedy and I'll never be able to do what I used to do. Well, you just might need to do those things differently. There's assumptions about unproductivity, that people aren't productive if they have disabilities, or they don't contribute to society. Sometimes people are portrayed as a burden or pitiful in media or in need of saving. There's this whole heroic thing that happens where people swoop in and save the person with a disability. Or, I don't really like this term because I don't like the term CRIP, but it's used in disability studies and other areas. It's derived from another word that I don't like to say ever. But there's this idea of super CRIP. So if you have a disability in media, you're often portrayed as you have superpowers, you're heroic, all this kind of stuff. Now, the way that this plays out, a great example is comics, right? If you look at comics, often the villains are the ones who have disabilities and they're portrayed in these ways, right? But people watch these things from a young age, and they don't question it. They're just like, oh yeah, that's an evil person, and they have usually a physical or a mental disability, right? And it gets ingrained in us from a young age. And then this plays out in society, so we see it so much. So this affects us again in a few ways. It affects general society because they start to believe these things. But if you're a person with a disability and you see this over and over and over again, you start to believe it's true. So what we call that in disability studies is internalized ableism. So we internalize, if you see yourself represented in a particular way so much, you start to believe it. So again, when I teach the course on disability in the media, I try to flip it. So okay, let's look at the ways that disability is challenged, or those attitudes are challenged in media, and how can we use media to flip the script? How do we use it to ensure that we're talking about disability in a more positive way? Make sense? Yeah. And the idea here is to, again, think about the inherent biases that we might carry with us. And, you know, I don't know everything about disability. I consider myself an expert. I've studied a long time. I have a lot of experience. But if you ask me about my personal experience, I can only tell you about my experience. I don't know what it's like for somebody else to have my exact disability because they don't experience it in the same way. So you really need to think about individual experiences. In terms of employment, if you see all these negative representations, it can be very hard to get a job. And it's really hard to prove discrimination. You can't just go to the Human Rights Commission and say, I didn't get that job because I have a disability. You have to be able to prove that. It's hard to prove it if you didn't get past the point of being interviewed because you came into the interview and they were like, oh no, that's a person with a disability. We can't go down that road, right? You can't really prove that. I think it's important to think about those barriers because there's a really, really strong link between poverty and disability. It's cyclical. Globally, this is found in every society, that because of all those structural barriers, people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty. And then also, when I was doing my dissertation, I was looking at women and trans people. There was less data on trans people and diverse genders at that time. But what I found in my research was that women with disabilities were more likely to live in poverty than women without disabilities and all men. And that women with disabilities were also more likely to be employed. I've broadened my work a little bit to talk about intersectionality. So the idea that we're a whole bunch of things all at once, right? Gender, race, citizenship status, all of these things, ability, they all affect age, all of these things affect our ability and the ways in which we interact in society. If we look at intersectionality theory, it also tells us that across time and space, that can change as well. So our experiences change across time, space, and based on the very complex nature of our identities. But for people with disabilities, as a population, more likely to live in poverty, which leads to all kinds of other issues and concerns. Okay, how are we doing for time? Oh my gosh, we're almost at time. Okay, I want to get to the employment and inclusion stuff. All right. There's the Canadian Survey on Disability. Have you heard of this? No. Okay, it's really hard to get access to this data. It costs thousands of dollars, okay? I've tried. I'm going down that process of trying to get open access because people with disabilities give this data freely. I think the government should give it back freely, but they don't at this point. But what we do know is that adults with disabilities had lower rates of employment in 2021 than those without, and that those between 25 and 64, 62% of people with disabilities, PWDs, people with disabilities, were employed compared to 78% of those without. Now, the Canadian Survey on Disability has a whole lot of other questions, which I mapped out when I was doing the Quality of Life Index I mentioned earlier, to look at, because it's not just about who's employed. Let's talk about meaningful employment. People want to love their jobs, right? They want to feel like they're doing something that they have agency and control over. Do they have full-time work? Is it precarious? How many hours do they work? Do they feel fulfilled, right? That's important too. It's not just about how many people get employed. What if it's part-time? What if it's not permanent, right? How many hours a week do people work? So there's lots of questions as well around, I can't read my own handwriting. How many hours of work, paid hours, permanent versus part-time, experiences advancing. So that's a key thing, like, are we able to advance in our careers or are we stuck at a particular point? There's a couple of questions around seeking modifications at work and seeking accommodations as well. I don't have access to that data yet. So there's other information, and it might be out there. I just haven't gone into a deep dive yet. I want to get it directly from Statistics Canada. But this was, again, I put a reference to what was freely available. They do offer, I should say, they do offer some information, but if you're doing work from an intersectional perspective, it can be very hard to get specific data. So that's the stats. People with disabilities are less likely to be employed. Misconceptions in the workplace. I worked for the Center for Research on Work and Disability Policy when I was doing my PhD. And I remember when I first started working there, I'm like, I don't really do employment. But then I realized I actually do. Like, I do a lot of work around, like, quality of life, social policy, and employment is really important. And so when I first started, I was like, is this really my field? And then quickly I was like, this is really interesting stuff. This is important. Because, I never really thought about what employers think of me. But there's a perception that accessibility is costly. Like, there's a person with a disability, we're going to have to do all of these things. Often, though, I would argue that the accommodations that people need are more about process than the built environment. There's a lot of organizations that don't have processes for identifying accommodations. And that's like one of the easiest things to address in some ways. Or that people with disabilities are more likely to be a legal or financial liability, so they're afraid, if I hire this person and something goes wrong, people with disabilities are no more of a liability than those without. Or that people with disabilities are less productive or more resource intense, also not the case. There's a business case to be made for hiring people with disabilities, higher retention rates, less time training people because they stay in their jobs longer, all kinds of things. So, I mean, sometimes you might have to change the built environment, but honestly, because of all the acts that we have, the built environment should be accessible anyway, right? Usually, again, it's about process and procedure. So, for example, parking. This one always gets me. So we have laws and regulations. Well, we have regulations around parking, right? There's usually so many accessible spots in a place close to a building. They have to be this wide, all of that. How many times do you see, like, people parking in their spots or blocking them for all kinds of reasons, right? Or when people pull up to where the curb cut is and they put their vehicle there because they have to run in real quick. That's very annoying, especially when I was using my walker and I would get to a place and there'd be a truck right at the ramp, right? So who enforces that? Who's looking at to make sure that those spots are always available when they need to be available? Because it's one thing to have it on paper that you have these accessible spots, but what if people get to work and they can't get into the spots because there's barriers there, right? Or automatic doors. Who do you call if those don't work? At York University, they had signs above each of those push buttons. Call this number if this button doesn't work. I think every organization should do that. Just put a phone number. Call security. I don't know how many times I've had to go to security and say, this button doesn't work. I just want to call you and tell you that, right? So little things, like there's easy ways to fix that. Have somebody dedicated to checking the parking spots if they're already checking the parking lot anyway, right? So those things are important. Right. So those are some misconceptions. Recommendations. I think I have about 10 minutes to go through this, and then I'll save some time for questions. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So when I worked at the Center for Research on Work and Disability Policy, I was so lucky I got to be involved with lots of different workshops with some very interesting policy people, people with lived experience. Also, policy people can be people with lived experience, so lots of intersections there. And we did a lot of different workshops looking at not just employment supports, but also disability supports. But we talked about recommendations. So I've given, if you're taking the slides with you, I've given you links to the report that we produced from those workshops and from all of that work that happened in Ontario, because it applies across the board. So inclusion and accessibility should be included in workplace policies and practices. So have a process in place for when you're hiring. Even the hiring process, I don't understand why organizations don't like to give the questions ahead of time. Let's think about this. If you're in your job, some of you might have to make a decision very quickly, but often we have a minute to reflect on what we're going to do before we do the thing, right? And so I like the idea of giving people questions ahead of time, especially if somebody has an anxiety condition or something like that, to help them, digest. Don't just give it 10 minutes ahead of time and see what they can do. Just give them the questions. Or like asking somebody, do you have any accommodation needs? When when you're calling them to give them an interview. Don't just wait for them to ask you if you need, ask you for accommodations. Again, they should be discussed at every stage of employment from recruitment. So in your ads, some organizations will do this. They'll say that they hire people that reflect the people they serve. So they'll hire people with disabilities. I once had somebody ask me, how can I have more people with disabilities in my organization? And I said, okay, well, do you promote inclusion and accessibility on your website? Are there stories of inclusion, of successful practice that you put out into the world? And then do you put it in your recruitment ads to say, I want to hire more diverse individuals to reflect society? If you do these things, if people go to your website and they see accessibility features on your website, or even the website itself is accessible, that's probably going to make them feel more like they can apply for the job. And then that should be ongoing, right? So when you hire the person, ask them, do you need any accommodations? What can I do to make your job successful for you? And then people with disabilities should be at all levels, right? Like top, down, down, up, whatever. I think people need to be reflected at all levels within an organization. If we think about accommodation, like I said before, we have all kinds of accommodations that happen, and disability-related accommodations should be the same. Oh, yeah, so within collective agreements, accessibility should be written in collective agreements, because then it's right there, it's like your rights are right there, they're all laid out, right? From a union perspective, if you already don't have language around, I haven't read your collective agreement, so I don't know, but if you don't have language around accessibility and accommodation, maybe think about addressing that when you're negotiating. Again, this will embed those accommodations right into your organization's commitments, right? So what you could do is have like, this is the process. I don't like when organizations ask you to disclose your medical condition. I think in terms of education, all the people need is your accommodation need. So if a doctor's giving you a certificate to say that you need an accommodation, just say what the accommodation need is. We don't ask people for their medical history if you don't have a disability, usually, right? So we shouldn't be asking people with disabilities to tell you the very specific nature of their disability. Just identify what the accommodation needs are. A doctor can do that. They can say, you know, this employee requires these accommodations due to a medical condition, or whatever the case might be, because unfortunately disability is often still very medicalized. And then you could have a section in your agreement that says that that the employer will report back to the union every year, maybe, on how many accommodations did they give, what kinds of accommodations, right? Because then you have that information. And then people will feel included. If they look at their collective agreement and there's a process laid out for this is how you go about getting your accommodation, then they feel protected as well, right? There's that risk of requesting accommodation isn't as high if you feel like you're protected by your union. So this one's really important. And then, like I said, accessibility should be promoted in your organization on websites and things like that. They should be, the accommodations should be treated just like any other kinds of accommodation. And then this is really important, disability should be discussed as an asset, because we bring a lot to the table when we bring our full experience and we feel like we can be our authentic selves, right? Especially for people who have episodic or hidden disabilities, they often feel like they're hiding a part of themselves. And I feel really sad about that. I don't have a choice, I don't ever hide who I am. It's a real strong part of my identity, and I want other people to be able to feel like that as well. And even I work at Cape Breton University, I feel like not only was I accommodated from the beginning in an easy way that I didn't have to think about, I feel like my experience, my embodiment, of course I have a degree in disability studies, my intellectual abilities to discuss disability, they're all assets in my organization. I don't ever feel like I'm at risk for being who I am. And I think that's really important, and that's where you want to get to within an organization in terms of employment. I think that was where I was going to leave it in terms of recommendations. I'll just conclude by saying that the burden of disability is often, or the burden of accommodation is often placed on people with disabilities to disclose. And so be proactive in those accommodation procedures. Instead, disability inclusion and accessibility should be part of your culture. In order to remove barriers to accessibility, we need to have more conversations. That's why I was really excited when I got the invitation to speak here, because I was like, this is great. This means this organization wants to have a conversation. And even if you don't know anything about disability or accommodation, this is a great place to start, right? Having the conversation and not being afraid to discuss and think about accessibility. Again, if I may reiterate, the benefits of providing accommodation will far outweigh the costs. Because again, if people feel supported and authentically themselves, they will be very productive, especially if people love their jobs. we always do a better job when we feel like we're supported. Okay,